Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 17th of February of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates. Today we have significant progress of the Russian armed forces, and probably the most important update is that as a result of very fierce clashes, the Russians managed to establish complete control over Avdiivka itself. At least this information was confirmed by different sources, including pro-Russian mappers, pro-Ukraine mappers, neutral mappers, and the most important, the Russian progress was confirmed by the flags established over the entire Avdiivka. So the battle has ended. The Ukrainians were forced to step back, having significant losses. As you can see, there are a lot of geolocations, and very likely we're not going to watch each of them, but we need to classify and to understand what did happen during the day and what is the next things. And according to information we have, today we received, let's say, 5 types of videos, 5 types of updates. The first type of update is the Ukrainian attempts and requests for evacuation. The Ukrainians were asking for evacuation during the day, trying to get their authorities, asking them to evacuate wounded soldiers, to evacuate, let's say, those who were encircled or got, encircled by the Russians or got trapped. And obviously, the Ukrainians didn't have any possibilities for these purposes. The next type of video we received from the Ukrainian side were the videos of significant number of prisoners of war. The Russians captured significant number of soldiers in every single part of Avdiivka, on the southern part, in the central part, in the area of the Tsarskaya Khota. Lots of soldiers were captured in the vicinity of the former air defense base. The sources reported that the Russians managed to encircle the Ukrainian lieutenant of 3rd Azov Brigade. The Ukrainians, when the situation was collapsing, took a decision to counterattack. The Russians probably were planning to maintain the main, evacuation road for the Ukrainians to maintain the evacuation road. So the Ukrainians from the central and the eastern part had possibilities for evacuation because the cauldron was collapsing or something like this. And for those purposes, the Ukrainians used around company of soldiers, but they were encircled by the Russians and destroyed. Just 20 soldiers managed to survive, and the Russians once again managed to capture the Ukrainian lieutenant. Also, we have the videos of prisoners of war from every part of Avdiivka, and obviously we're going to receive more and more. So this is the second type of video we received during the previous 24 hours. The third type of video we received is the video of significant casualties and dead Ukrainian soldiers all over the entire Avdiivka, on the streets, on the buildings, on the roofs, in the basements, in the fortifications, in light vehicles, and personal armored carriers, and tanks everywhere. So it's not Avdiivka from now on, probably is the new cemetery of Ukrainian armed forces. Of course, we will not watch this video because due to the casualties and that this is not very good content to show on the YouTube. So this is the third type of video we received, and the fourth type of video during the day, significant number of this type we received, of the attempts and the process of Ukraine evacuation, basically running away from the positions. The main activity, the main area of Ukrainian withdrawing positions were along the Industrial Avenue. For example, in this video we see another group of Ukrainian 3rd Azov Brigade who was waiting for evacuation machine, and after a few minutes the evacuation machine arrived. The Ukrainians entered this armored personnel carrier and started running away from their positions under very heavy Russian mortar, sniper, and rifle fire. So we got a lot of videos of this type. So they were running away, and this is, another video of the same thing with the Ukrainian soldiers were moving somewhere among the streets and buildings, among the ruins. They were moving very slowly, very, they are tired, exhausted, we understand. They were under very heavy fire. We don't know whether this group or managed to evacuate or not. Maybe they were abandoned or ambushed by the Russians somewhere further ahead. This video, we don't know. On this video, for example, we can see another evacuation group of Ukrainian forces who were moving from the south and the central part of Avdiivka in direction of the 9th quarter. So let's say the lakes, the rivers of soldiers, the roads of soldiers, the convoys of soldiers without armored vehicles. As you can see, no armored vehicles, just soldiers on their own feet without personal care, just one personal carry along the Industrial Avenue. So the area where the Ukrainians from Lastachkina or Orikhiv were able to enter to take another group and to evacuate. No vehicles from the central part that were heading to the western part or something like this. And of course, the Ukrainians were moving, let's say, through the streets as close as possible to the western edge of the city. And when talking about the western edge, the first video of first group of Ukrainian soldiers we received this morning, somewhere at 8 a.m. of the local time. On this video, we can see 5 Ukrainian soldiers, small group of 5 soldiers on the edge of Avdiivka. So this is the edge positions. This is already outskirts of the stronghold. We're leaving this area in direction of fields, in direction of the most difficult and most dangerous part of the foothold, the fields between, let's say, Ukrainian mainland and Avdiivka itself. This territory was bombed by the Russians heavily. Let's say hundreds of FABs, artillery shells arrived in this area. And the last video we received is the Ukrainian soldiers who were moving among the fields and basically already on the territory under Ukrainian control. So in this video we can see another group of Ukrainian soldiers with a very big distance between each soldier moving through the fields in the vicinity of Severna, so very far from Avdiivka itself. These are lucky guys. They managed to evacuate. They managed, and they think that the hell and the nightmare behind them. But to tell the truth, it's not true. Obviously, they just prolong the agony of the situation, because sooner or later they will be redeployed somewhere else, and they will be forced to start everything from the beginning. If you ask my opinion, I believe that the luckiest guys ever is the guys who were abandoned by the Ukrainians and who managed to surrender and was captured by the Russians and who managed to save their lives. These are the happiest guys, because everything finished for them today on the 17th of February. But when talking about these guys who managed to evacuate, everything has just started, and probably the biggest problems and the most difficult events are in front of them. And all these 4 types of video we received from the Ukrainian side. Once again, the request for evacuation, and then the second, the video of a lot of significant number of prisoners of war. The third video is the videos that we haven't opened on the map during this video, because like a lot of very terrible videos, a lot of casualties among the Ukrainians. And the final type of video, the process of evacuation. We see there is no tactic. We see there is no, let's say, centralization process. Everything was made as it was possible to be made. And of course, the fifth type of video we received today, we received from the Russian sources, and these are videos about the Russian flags established all over the entire Ukraine. Let's start from the northern direction. On this video, for example, we can see how the Russians were establishing the flag above the chemical plant. Of course, we see that the flag was established, let's say, on the eastern outskirts of the chemical plant. And of course, when talking about the coordinations and geolocations, we don't have the right to color the entire chemical plant under the color of Russian forces, of, let's say, red color. But we colored this territory because, first of all, most of the mappers made this. The second thing is that the Russians managed to establish control over flag over the building inside of the chemical plant. Of course, this is maybe not enough to coloring the area, but anyway, we see that the Russians in this area are feel themselves comfortable. They're not like trying to hide themselves from FPV drones or from snipers, so which means that this is secured area and the Ukrainians are very far from these territories. So, and furthermore, once again, most of the mappers have already updated their maps showing the entire chemical plant under the Russian control. The second video of Russian flag we received from the area of the lakes. On this territory we see some industrial zone, and we see a pipe growing from the ground, from the surface, and we see a Russian flag on this small pipe, so which also confirms the Russian progress in the central part, and that this territory also was captured completely by the Russians, captured, secured and cleared, and the Russian forces moved further to the south or to the central part or to the east or to the 9th quarter. Also, we have a lot of videos and a lot of flags from the railway station. On this video we can see Russian group of Russian soldiers hiding in the shadow of the building with Russian flag. This is the area where, according to information we have, the Ukrainians tried to counterattack with a small group of 3rd Brigade that was defeated, and most of the group was destroyed, and the officer of that group was captured by the Russians. We saw the video of the prisoner of war Then we got the video during the day of Russian flag on the eastern outskirts of the 9th quarter. This is the town hall. The Russians were establishing the flag and making photos on the town hall. First, the Russians took off the Ukrainian flag, and after that, the Russians established the Russian flag in this area. And the final geolocated confirmation of Russian progress we received from the southern part of the 9th quarter. We don't have video, we have just the picture of Russian flag above this territory, which also confirms additional Russian progress. Of course, we have some doubts and we have some open questions about, let's call it like the northwestern part of Avdiivka, whether the Russians managed to clear this territory or not, at least during the 17th of February, because we haven't received any geolocations from this area. But I believe that even if the Russians haven't managed to enter this territory right now, by the morning this territory will be completely cleared. And the same story about Avdiivka. We got the flag on the eastern part and the southern part, and we have just the videos of evacuation of Ukrainian soldiers along the main road. Very likely that few buildings, or at least these small barracks, still under Ukrainian control, or at least in the gray zone, and Ukrainian rear guard forces try to secure this area until the last soldier leave Avdiivka. But very likely in the morning this territory also will be under complete Russian control. So once again, and another important thing that I would like to discuss is with you, during the previous 48 hours, we received significant number of updates from the northern part, from the central part, from the industrial avenue, from the 9th quarter. But once again, during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received even a single geolocated video from the southern part, from the area in the vicinity of Tsarskaya Khota, and very likely that hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers were encircled in this area. We still haven't received anything, but the Russians will complete the clearing operation. Obviously, the next few days we're going to receive more and more updates exactly from this territory. There are still a lot of points of Ukrainian resistance. A lot of Ukrainians were abandoned in the basements. A lot of Ukrainians were abandoned in the shelters and strongholds. A lot of groups of Ukrainians still don't have any connection with the mainland. They don't know for sure what is happening in this area. Maybe some of them still thinks that there are still clashes for Avdiivka. So the next few days the Russians will continue clearing and clearing operation. Now it's time to work for engineering forces, for demining processes, and so on. And obviously, for now, the only question I have, when the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation will announce the complete control over Avdiivka. I don't think that this is going to happen tomorrow, but obviously the Russians will try to announce the complete, control over Avdiivka before the anniversary of the beginning of the special military operation. As you know, this operation started on the 24th of February of 2022. So by this date, obviously, we're going to receive final confirmation from the Ministry of Defense. And as I understand, they will try to announce this, situation as close as possible to this date, like anniversary and something like this. So for some celebration purposes and things for the Russians, and Russian Federation as well. And now we have the final and the most important question, few things to discuss. According to information we have, there are very heavy clashes on the line between Lastachkina and the chemical plant. The Russians continue offensive operation. Currently, just before I start making the video, we got some report that the Russians launched an offensive operation with the purpose to answer Lastachkina with the storm squads, and very likely the Russians are able to do this during the next night. Tomorrow in the morning we're going to receive more updates about the clashes. So, but it's like the first things before I would like to discuss with you what are the purposes and where the Russians are going to stop and to end Avdiivka offensive operation, because Avdiivka offensive operation is not just the battle for the borders of Avdiivka, because the Russians have already reached the borders of Avdiivka itself, and the question is where the Avdiivka offensive operation is going to be finished by the Russians according to, original plan. And to receive and to answer this question, we need to answer three questions. First question is, where is the next Ukrainian defense belt? Because this question and answer to this question will give us more or less approximate understanding of the situation where the Russians can get without, big problems and big resistance from the Ukrainian forces. The second question we have, whether the Russian forces were exhausted or not during the battle for Avdiivka. And the third question we have, what is the main goals of the Russians on this direction? If we answer these three questions, we will have understanding and the answer to the question where the Russians are planning to end Avdiivka offensive operation. So let's start from the first question. Where is the next Ukrainian defense belt? More or less reliable defense belt. Of course, when talking about the Ukrainians, more or less reliable defense belts of the Ukrainian forces lays along rivers and lakes, and let's say along railways, Acheretina, railways, rivers, lakes, and so on. So if we move to this area, this is more or less the next Ukrainian defense belt that Ukrainians for use for defense purposes, where the Ukrainians can count that they are able to slow down the Russians and stop them maybe for a few days or maybe months, who knows. So there is a railway, a very powerful and let's say very strong defense belt. Then there is a river, Berdichi, another river, another small lake, Durna River. Then Durna River goes to the south. There are a lot of water reservoirs. Additional river, another Durna River. Then Durna River goes to Vovcha. So these are like defense belt. A lot of rivers, a lot of natural barriers that Ukrainians can use for defense purposes. And obviously the Russians will be forced to pay significant time, maybe days, maybe hours, maybe months, to bypass this territory for further offensive operations. So we can say that until the Russians reach this yellow line, they still have chances to capture everything due to the poor, let's say, defense fortifications between the yellow line and Avdiivka itself. The second question was whether the Russians were exhausted or not during the battle for Avdiivka. I must say that the Russians weren't exhausted. We can compare the battle for Avdiivka once again with the battle for Bakhmut and Mariupol, when those battles finished just after the Russians managed to establish control over the final square meter of those cities. And when talking about Avdiivka, the Russians captured just 10% of the city, of the stronghold, and the battle was finished by the Russians, and the Ukrainians start running away, abandoning their positions, armored vehicles, ammo depots, and many other things. So obviously the Russians weren't exhausted. They still have forces, they still have reserves, and they can continue moving further. And so we understand that the Russians do have forces to move this yellow line, towards this yellow line. And the third question was, what is the main purposes of the Russian offensive operation of Avdiivka? And the main purpose of this attack is to move as far as possible Ukrainian artillery forces from Donetsk. So that was, Avdiivka was more political, let's say, offensive operation than tactical, because Donetsk is stronghold. The Ukrainians didn't have possibilities to attack, but from political perspective, Ukrainians were bombing Donetsk heavily during the previous months. They were attacking the city with cluster rounds, with 155 millimeters, with multi-launch rocket sourced. If you remember, the Ukrainians were mining this area with mines, with distance mining method. So of course it was political decision before elections as well, to force the Ukrainians to step back and to increase the range and to move as far as possible the Ukrainian artillery. And of course, just to capture Avdiivka is not enough to move Ukrainian artillery, because from, let's say, Umansk itself, the Ukrainians still have possibilities to bomb the Russians, let's say, with artillery with 155 millimeters rounds, with multi-launch rocket systems, and continue casual killing civilians from the capital of DPR. So of course we understand that all these three answers to those three questions we asked tell us that very likely the Russians will stop Avdiivka offensive operation only after they reach a minimum. The progress will be like the getting to the yellow line. Obviously, this is as must operation for the Russians to move as far as possible the Ukrainian artillery from Donetsk and to reduce the bombing and attacking and casualties among civilians. This is the vital question, vital from political perspective question for the Russian authorities. But from the other side, for example, if we calculate the distance from yellow line to, let's say, the Russian to Opытное Vodiane, the distance would be on some points increased to, let's say, from these positions to this for another 10 kilometers. So it's not enough, of course, to reduce the number of bombings with the HIMARS system, but obviously the Ukrainians from now on are no longer able to use artillery rounds like M77 howitzer or Soviet howitzers, because if they want to use this type of weapon and to bomb Donetsk, they would be forced to bring this type of weapon as close as possible to the line of combat contact, and they will be destroyed basically by the Russians, let's let's say, Lancet and Russian counter-artillery duels. So that's why, even from this perspective, from the northern direction, the Ukrainians probably have just one possibility to use HIMARS, maybe to use some, let's say, self-profit howitzers like Paladin or Susanna or Dana or, let's say, Caesar. Maybe these artillery systems still allows the Ukrainians to bomb, but anyway, the Ukrainians don't have enough of these systems, and they don't have some problems, a lot of problems with artillery rounds as well. So the Russians managed to solve the issue at least partly, at least from the northern direction. But we understand that there are still problems on the western flank of Donetsk. There are still problems that are coming from Nivoyska, Krasnogorovka, Georgievka, Pobeda, Novomikhailovka. But we know that the Russians have finished the battle for Avdiivka. The Ukrainians furthermore announced about evacuation from Ocheretina, and the Ukrainians also published another Abrams running somewhere as far as possible from Donetsk. I don't know for what purposes this tank is running, maybe just to increase the spirit of Ukrainian soldiers. But anyway, from the western part there are still problems, but we know that currently the Russians are trying to solve this issue, and we have today a lot of updates from Novomikhailovka itself. The Russians managed to establish control over the northern part of the village. At least we have geolocation of the beginning of offensive operation. Currently we don't know for sure whether the Russians managed to establish complete control or not. Furthermore, we got reports about control over the barracks and over the cemetery to the southern part. So anyway, the battle for Novomikhailovka is about to be finished, or by the Russians as well. So it's not like we can say the days of Novomikhailovka are numbered. We continue receiving almost every single day updates about the further Russian progress in direction of Pobeda. And right before I start making the video, we got another, let's say, video of bombing this village. So very likely the Russians will attack and capture this village very soon. We continue receiving updates of Russian progress in Georgievka. So all these things from the south Donetsk direction, and of course additional progress of the Russian forces to the southeast of Nivoyska also confirms additional Russian progress and some plans to capture the village. And we also almost every single day we continue receiving updates about additional progress of the Russian forces inside of Pervomaiska. So all these things, all these attacks, just without attacks in Krasnogorovka, there were no attacks in this direction, can give us some understanding that very likely the Russians will move their focus here as well, with the purpose to establish control over every single village, Georgievka, Pobeda, Novomikhailovka, Paraskovievka, and to create another buffer zone and to move Ukrainian artillery as far as possible on the south Donetsk direction as well. So this is like the second thing, this is the second end point of Avdiivka offensive operation, to move artillery from the western flank of Donetsk as well, and the Russians are doing their best to do this. And of course, if the Russians are able to reach the yellow line to establish control over Nivoyska, Krasnogorovka, Georgievka, Pobeda, Novomikhailovka, we understand that the Ukrainian foothold between Ugledar and Konstantinovka will be collapsed automatically by the Russians. So when talking about the final scope of Avdiivka offensive operation, this is the final scope. This is buffer zone from Donetsk, 10-kilometer line from current positions to, let's say, the mainland, to Pokrovsk, to Velika Novosovka. So this is the end, and this is the final end of Avdiivka offensive operation. The Russians basically managed to bypass just, let's say, 10% of this operation when talking about square meters, when talking about the capturing of Avdiivka. But when talking about the manpower, about the rest things they need to, they have already bypassed 80%. About square meters, just 10%. About the entire progress, around 70-80 when talking about manpower, about Ukrainian main forces. So you understand what I'm trying to say. Now we are moving to the second, probably the most important area, to Zaporozhye direction. Today, the Russian sources start in Ukraine, either the Russians and the Ukrainian sources started reporting about the beginning of Russian offensive operation on this direction. The sources were saying that the Russians managed to reduce the distance between the edge Russian positions and the Ukrainians, that the main forces of the Russian army that are involved in this operation is 42nd, 7th and 76th divisions, and so lots of different sources, independent resources reported about those attacks, that the Russians managed to capture the strongholds, the trenches, different sources. But when talking about geolocations, we received just 2 geolocations from this area. The first geolocation took place in the fields between Robotyne itself and Verbova. The Russians were bombing this territory with multi-launch rocket systems, which basically doesn't mean anything because every single day we receive the same video, almost the video of the same type. But later, right before I start making the video, we got this geolocation. On this video we can see how the Ukrainians were bombing the Russians on the south of Robotyne. The trenches, the main trenches, were under very heavy fire from the Ukrainian side, which confirms the Russian progress, and that as a result of let's say attack of 17th of February, the Russians managed to establish control over something like this. So those updates about the Russian offensive in Zaporozhye wasn't fake, wasn't something like a joke, wasn't something like attempt to change the media and to force the Ukrainians to be in panic or something like this. The Russians did start offensive operation, and they have already entered the final defense belt before Robotyne itself. During the previous days, we got a lot of geolocations, a lot of videos from the Russian side or from the Ukrainian side of attacks on the positions of 65th Brigade on the western flank. So very likely during the night there are going to be very heavy clashes, and very likely that in the morning update we're going to receive first geolocations and first videos from Robotyne itself. But once again, according to Ukrainian sources, the Russians concentrated on Zaporozhye area an army bigger than the army that was concentrated that was used for Avdiivka offensive operation. So according to the sources we have, the Russians used around 40,000 soldiers to storm Avdiivka. So very likely on Zaporozhye direction we can find let's say 60,000 army, and obviously this army is too big to capture just Robotyne and the fields between Robotyne and Verbova. Very likely the Russians are planning to move further, and very likely the Russians are planning to attack Orikhiv. And also right before I start making the video, the sources reported about intensifying of activity and Russian actions in Kamyanskaya direction. So very likely that the Russians are planning to attack, let's say, along these lines and to try to establish control over this part of Zaporozhye with the purpose to get as close as possible to the main supply roads that goes through Zaporozhye in direction of the on Donetsk direction. So the clash has just started, and the most important part of the special military operation has begun. When talking about Bakhmut Artyomov, no changes. The Russians continue storming and bombing this territory. The Ukrainians reported that the defense belt in this area is not ready, wasn't prepared by the Ukrainians properly, so they're like trying to excuse that very likely the Ukrainians would be forced to step back from this direction as well. So the situation is getting worse and worse. Additional things we start receiving from Terny after a few days of operational pause. The Ukrainian sources first published the videos of FPV drone strikes against significant number of Russian armored vehicles who were attacking the Ukrainians in direction of Zhiribets River, Terny, Yampolovka. A lot of tanks were FPV droned by the Ukrainians on this area, and after all these videos were published, the Russian sources start updating the maps showing the additional progress of the Russian armed forces. And according to additional progress, the Russians got very close to let's say Terny, and as a result of offensive operation the Russians managed to establish control over something like this. So this is the progress according to the Russian sources for the previous 24 hours or something like this on this direction. So if this update will become, if these updates are confirmed, then the distance between the edge buildings of Terny and the Russian, let's say, edge positions would be less than 1.28 kilometers. So the Russians are getting closer and closer, and we see that the situation for the Ukrainians is worsening. No updates about Kupiansk area, no updates about Krynki, Kherson direction, and lots of updates about Zelensky himself. As we know, Zelensky already signed, let's say, security agreements with Germany. He visited and had meeting with Scholz. Then he visited France and had meeting with Macron. He signed agreement as well. And so we have already 3 countries signed agreements: United Kingdom, Paris, France, and Germany. After that, Zelensky gave lots of things. He blamed Western countries in the fall of Avdiivka, saying that it's not Ukraine's fault, it's the Western countries' fault because they didn't provide Ukraine artillery rounds and so on. And also he made a very important statement about the United States of America, saying that if states are not going to provide Ukrainians let's say, help. The United States will not be strategical partner anymore, and the Ukrainians will change their focus to the European Union. So it's like something new in the special military operation. So we'll see. But anyway, once again, I'll repeat my idea that the main purpose of Zelensky in Europe not to sign contracts with every single member of European Union or something like this. The most important reason is security reason. Western countries just want to move Zelensky from Ukraine, from the critical situation, because nobody knows how how all these battles can be finished. The entire situation can be collapsed very fast and the Ukrainians will surrender. So that's why the European countries need to have Zelensky, the legal president, under their control, because we know that Zelensky signed some security agreements, but nobody knows what exactly Zelensky signed with all these countries. Who knows, maybe Zelensky have arrived in Poland and signed with Poland agreement that half of Ukraine from now on is a part of Poland. Who knows? Nobody can know that, because he is the legal president, he has legal power, at least in the end of March. And he can send whatever he likes. Contracts, obligations, credits, anything. Even he can sign an agreement that Ukraine, let's say, western part of Ukraine is from now on under Poland, the central part belongs to Germany, the southern part belongs to France. He's the president for now. He can do whatever he likes. And Ukraine parliament will adopt every single law under his control, at least until the end of March. So maybe the Ukraine has, by all these visits, all these things, all these agreements, it's not just like the agreements with security reasons. Maybe this is the agreements to split Ukraine as Germany was split after the Second World War. There was like territories of interest of each country. Maybe Zelensky signed with every single country the same agreements of territories of interest in Ukraine. So he split Ukraine between the European countries. Who will control what? Nobody knows. And we will never find out until this happens. And this will happen when the Russians will penetrate the first defense belt, and at least when the Russians reach the Dnieper River. So anything might happen. And that's it for today. Military Summer channel reminds you to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.